The year is 1136. For decades, England has been embroiled in expensive wars with foreign lands. Germany, France, Italy, Denmark. The costs have been mounting up along with its fallen bodies. None of the wars have been successful, and its people have been taxed to ruin in order to pay for it. In the castles, the knights and the lords sit and extort the commoners. And in the taverns and the halls and the hovels, the people cry out for a hero, someone true and just, who can restore true meaning to the word knighthood. It was March, and Uther was tired, and too many people had died, and not enough of them were the right ones. For the past 12 months, his forces had been waged in war against the forces of King Gawain of Cornwall. They had been winning, it had seemed, at least for a time. Their victories early in the campaign had been swift. Cornwall's forces had been forced back across its lands. Towns had been set fire to. Villages had been razed to the ground. And now King Gawain of Cornwall was trapped in the castle of Tintagel, just off the Cornish coast. That castle was the citadel of the Low King's realm. One tall outcrop of a castle high up upon jagged rocks that broke off on a small peninsula from the land, only reachable by a narrow causeway of rock. It was unassailable by all sides other than that by that narrow causeway. Boats could not reach it, for the cliffs and the rocks were too high and too jagged and too slippery from the waves that beat against them. From no other side could any forces reach it. For the past 6 months, in fact, King Uther Pendragon's forces had been holding it at siege. They had built an encampment in the village of Troen, not a few miles from Tintagel. And each day men went out to the front lines there to try and sally against the castle, to try and force their way down the causeway, perhaps to force the gates open. And each day did King Gawain's forces go and fire down arrow after arrow upon the men as they ran against the causeway. They would fall dead or fall off to the rocks and the waves below and die there. At night, those Cornish archers would sneak back out through the castle to go and take their arrows from the fallen men. It was a bloody, pointless battle. The men were becoming discontent. It was futile. All that happened was Uther Pendragon's men went day after day, and the lucky ones were the ones who came back to find their feet rotting from the mud and their stomachs starving from the lack of food. And when they complained to their captains told them to shut it. Food would be on its way, and if they were that desperate for it, why didn't they get out there and take the castle? Night after night, more and more men left. They slipped out from the front lines and went back out of Cornwall to England, to better wages, to food, to their families. And each day Uther would wake to be told of how many men had left, and how much it was costing him to hold siege to the castle, and how much he was in debt, and just what he would have to sell from his kingdom today to be able to take Tintagel. There wasn't much left to sell. Uther Pendragon was High King of England, King of Kings. The realm was supposedly his. But it's hard to govern a realm the size of Britain, and so Uther had sold off parts of it to the Low Kings for them to lease out to farmers and bring in an income upon their own lands, and so that Uther might tax them and the taxes would come back to him. And that was fine. But for the past 20 years, King Uther Pendragon had been locked in wars. Wars against the French, wars against the Germans, against the Danes, against the Italians, now against the Cornish. Taxes had gone up and up year upon year until all of his advisors told him that if he were to raise the taxes any further, then surely the people would revolt and tear down the palace of Westminster where Uther lived. Uther was at breaking point. Indeed, there would have been no way that he could have financed this war against Cornwall if it was not for the fact that he was able to borrow money from the banks of the kings of Scotland. Those kings, led by Lot of Orkney, were willing to extend him a very long line of credit indeed, and then to make him pay. Lands were given to the Low Kings of Scotland. Arms were given to them. Treasures were given to them. Contracts for trade were given to them. Uther had very little left to give now. And so, this morning, he had woken up to be told by his chancellor that unless he took the fortress of Tintagel within the next week, the kingdom would be bankrupt. The Scottish kings would cease to extend their line of credit, and Uther would be in ruins. Uther had to take Tintagel back. But why? Why was it so important for Uther to take back the castle of Tintagel, I hear you ask? Well, let me tell you. It was for love. Now, when you hear me talk about love, you might think that I am speaking of the courtly love, of the romances of old. But no, ladies and gents, I speak of something much baser, much more illicit. For it was but 12 years ago that King Gawain came to the Palace of Westminster to present his new wife, Igraine, to King Uther Pendragon. 12 years ago, ladies and gents, since Uther sat upon his high throne, as Gawain walked into the throne room, there with the most beautiful, radiant creature walking by his side, and Uther knew at that moment in time that he had to have her. And she, in turn, catching sight of the lust in Uther's eyes, knew that she wanted him too. Yes, ladies and gents, I speak to you of a terrible affair. King Gawain of Cornwall, you see, was not ever actually meant to be King of Cornwall. Gawain was in fact the fourth son of his father, the fourth in line to the throne. There was no way he would ever be likely to take charge of Cornwall. And so, rather than raise him in the ways of war, rather than raise him in the ways of court, rather than raise him in the ways of politics, his family chose instead to send him to a monastery. Gawain of Cornwall was meant to be a monk. His life was meant to be spent illuminating manuscripts in cold halls. As it was, that life was the thing that saved him. For it was one winter, when Gawain was only 20 years old, that a terrible outbreak of plague went and raged through Cornwall. No one was safe. Pauper or nobleman, so many fell beneath its strong grip. The King of Cornwall died, as well as his 3 sons, the only person of the line of Cornwall who was left was Gawain the monk. And so Gawain the monk was brought back to Tintagel, to the seat of Cornwall's power, and he there was made king of Cornwall. And he in turn had to marry Igraine. Now, Igraine had thought that she would be marrying some great king. Igraine had thought that she would be marrying the king of Cornwall, a noble warrior, a fighter, someone brave and handsome that minstrels sung songs about, that adventures were told about, someone who would create a great legend behind them. And what she got instead was the quiet, shy, retreating Gawain, always embarrassed that he was married to a woman, or never quite sure what to do, whether his marital obligations were a sin or whether they were just. Gawain, who was far, far happier when he was reading books or illuminating manuscripts than he was deciding on matters of state or war. Gawain, who was so small and so slight that when he wore the robes of office they seemed to pile up upon his shoulders and make him walk with a stoop. How could anybody expect Igraine to have anything other than lust in her eyes when she saw King Uther Pendragon, noble, strong, handsome, and confident upon his throne? The two quickly fell into a sordid love affair, and they hardly bothered to keep it a secret either. And for the most part, even Gawain ignored it. He was too embarrassed to raise his voice to the king or to his wife. He turned a blind eye to this affair as it took place. Uther's advisors told him that he should stop, that a scandal could be in the makings here, that if Gawain were to take offence by this and were to somehow raise support amongst the other Low Kings, that civil war could break out, that it was wrong to have an affair with a Low Queen, a noble lady, perhaps that may have been acceptable, but for the Queen of Cornwall, was he mad? Well, those who dared to suggest that Uther Pendragon was mad quickly found themselves on the executioner's block, and so dissenting voices began to cease. And then one morning, Uther Pendragon awoke to be told that Igraine of Cornwall had left, along with Gawain and all of their household and all of their staff. They had left the palace of Westminster and returned to Cornwall. Uther couldn't understand it. Why would Igraine leave? It must have been Gawain himself, Gawain taking her away. Uther began to think of reasons or excuses that he might go to Tintagel to visit King Gawain and resume his affair with Gawain's wife. He wrote to Igraine, but Igraine did not answer. And 9 months later, Uther received news that Igraine of Cornwall had given birth to a son. Uther's son. The rumour that Uther had managed to get the wife of one of his Low Kings pregnant with child quickly spread throughout the land. And it was a dangerous rumour indeed. For if Gawain were to believe it, to believe that the High King had sired a child upon his wife, he would surely have grounds then to go and raise an army against the king. And indeed, even if Gawain didn't, then those Low Kings who were discontent with Uther would have surely been justified in going to Gawain, in persuading him to start up a war, and in leading it against him. His advisors were quick to tell Uther that he needed to do everything he could to squash these rumours. And Uther did it the only way he knew how. Anyone who was even heard mentioning it was swiftly taken to the Tower of London and there executed. Anyone who had heard someone mentioning it was silenced. And so, quickly, it ceased to be spoken of throughout the kingdom. Gawain made no mention of it, and indeed Gawain made no mention of his son. Uther ceased to send letters to Igraine, and Igraine and Gawain never came to the Palace of Westminster again. The matter was forgotten for 12 years. 12 years is a long time, ladies and gents. Uther satisfied himself in those years by taking part in incredibly expensive campaigns and wars against the Danes, Germans, French, Italians, Spanish, anyone with an army that Uther could fight against. He delighted in the revels of war. And in time, those wars became expensive, very expensive indeed, for though Uther may have delighted in them, he was not successful in those wars. Taxes were raised and raised and raised again until it seemed that all the people of Britain were living on but a crust, and at any moment they might riot. And in those 12 years, ladies and gents, Uther Pendragon had failed to create a single sire. He had been married 5 times in those years, but neither daughter nor son was born to him by any of those women. And so, with a country that was on the verge of riot, with a bank that was almost empty, with armies that were being thwarted across Europe, voices quickly began to mutter and to suggest that the time was ripe to overthrow King Uther Pendragon, that with no money, that with a weak army, that with a riotous realm, who would stand in favour of Uther Pendragon? There was no heir to succeed him, no heir to put the faith of the people in, no heir for anyone to rally around. The Low Kings of England would soon start to talk amongst themselves of which one of them would replace Uther Pendragon if Uther Pendragon were to die with no heir. And so Uther became desperate. And after 12 years, ladies and gents, he thought once more of that son that rumour had it he had kept within the walls of Tintagel in Cornwall. After 12 years of quashing rumours that that child was his, Uther began to suggest once again that the child of Igraine was in fact the heir of Uther Pendragon. And damn it, that King Gawain had stolen away Uther's heir, and that Gawain was planning to go and raise an army against him and overthrow the throne. And so Uther whipped up the Low Kings of England into a frenzy and led them into a bloody battle against Gawain of Cornwall. It was an expensive war, ladies and gents. It was one that was set to almost bankrupt him, but Uther had everything to gain if he could conquer Tintagel and bring that son back to London. And so we find ourselves, ladies and gents, in the old church of the village of Trouen, where King Uther Pendragon had set up his campaign headquarters as he planned out the siege of Tintagel. Not 3 miles away, King Gawain and Igraine and their son were holed up inside the walls of that fortress, protected by rocks and waves and that narrow causeway. And Uther found himself listening intently for food. And Uther found himself listening intently for hoofs. And Uther found himself listening intently for the sound of a horse's approach. He'd been waiting for it for the past 2 days as he went over the list of his debts. And now he heard hoofs approaching, and from outside the church door one of his guards called out, "Man to see you, sir." "Let him in," said Uther Pendragon. And through the church doors stepped a man, tall, albeit slightly stooped, wearing dark brown-red clothing, tight-fitting leather, simple, not made to withstand the attack from a knight in the depths of battle, but perhaps good enough to protect in close quarters against a glancing blow once you'd infiltrated a castle. The man in question was old, not as old as Uther, but he had gone past the mark of 40, and grey had begun to enter into the beard that hung from his face and the hair around his eyes. "You are Merlin, the miner," said Uther. "I am Merlin of Avalon." "And you mine," said Uther, "in rocks, yes?" "I have been known to mine from time to time," said Merlin, "yes." "Hardly a real job, is it?" "You summon me," said Merlin. "I want you to get me into that castle," said Uther Pendragon. "Have you tried knocking?" "Don't toy with me, miner," said Uther. "What is it that makes you think you have a right to enter the castle?" asked Merlin. Right! I am Uther Pendragon, High King of England. Alright, it is my right to do whatever I please, and my right to insist that you get me in there, miner. I am your king. Merlin maintained his composure. Avalon does not recognize a high king. We are neutral, he said. That is the treaty that has always been. That is the treaty that cannot be broken. That is the treaty that binds you, sir. I am here by your request, but by no means am I bound. Bah! Damn your treaty, said Uther Pendragon. Your treaty will be in ruins if you don't get me into that castle. I swear, you either get me into Tintagel or I will take these forces and take them up into Wales tomorrow and bring fire and ruin to Avalon. In the same way that you brought fire and ruin to Tintagel, asked Merlin. He couldn't suppress the slight smirk that ran over his face. The kingdom of Avalon was one of high, high rocks and mountains, and lakes and rivers and passes and reefs. No one could enter the kingdom of Avalon without knowing the secret ways, and the secret ways were only known to the people of Avalon. Uther could never reach into that realm, and Uther knew it. Uther tried a different tack. Merlin of Avalon, as you call yourself. Perhaps you might forgive me, I have been under strain recently. Within that castle lies my heir, the heir to England, without which it is almost without doubt that civil war and ruin will fall upon this kingdom. I request the help of Avalon in order to reclaim my son and to restore stability to the realm. Can I count upon my loyal allies of Avalon to lend me their support? Why, yes, said Merlin. For a price. Price? Damn it, man, do you toy with me? You know how much I'm already in debt to those Scottish kings. There's nothing left. I'm asking you to do this as a favour, and the favour of the king will be something valuable indeed, I swear. I do not ask for money, sire, or for land, or... Go on then, what is it? You can't have the daughters. I've already had to promise bloody Gawain's daughters to the Scottish kings. I do not want the daughters. We request the son. What? The son. We request the son, said Merlin. I need the son, you fool, he said. Why would we give the son to Avalon? What do you take me for? Sire, I take you for a king who wants to do the best by his realm. Now, it strikes me that for the past 12 years, this boy has been raised in Cornwall. Now, Cornwall is still suffering the effects of the plague that took it years ago. As well you know, their schools, their education is hardly befitting of one who would be expected to rule over all England, and Gawain is hardly the best teacher for that. And yet you do know that in Avalon are some of the finest minds and libraries and universities in all of this realm. We do not ask to keep the child, sire, but for the safety of this realm that we are allied with, we ask that you allow us to raise him in Avalon until his 15th birthday. On his 15th birthday, when he becomes of age, we will return him unto you, we swear, and in the meantime, we will train him in all the skills and wisdom that he needs to rule this realm. That is what we ask. Fine! Fine, said Uther. You may have the boy to train and to teach. Just get him out of that fortress. Very well, said Merlin. It shall be done. I have brought with me some of the miners of Avalon and our tools. Tonight we will begin the tunneling process. By tomorrow we shall have entered into the castle, and you shall have your son. This is our word and our bond. And Uther smiled as Merlin left that church at Trouen to round up the miners of Avalon and to begin their plan to mine deep beneath the rocks of Tintagel and into that fortress, and to bring the sun back. Hello ladies and gents, I hope that you enjoyed tonight's tale. The best is yet to come though. So to get more amazing tales, make sure that you've liked the Facebook page. If you could tell someone else about the show as well, it would really mean a lot.